to another episode of Critic Reading Writing. My name is Actor Quayson, and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. Like James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues that we discussed last week, Toni Morrison's Jazz is set in Harlem, but in the 1920s. The novel is set after World War I, thus also during the Jazz age and the Harlem Renaissance, when a new cultural flowering of both music and literature took place that came to have resonance all across America and indeed in the rest of the world. Morrison's novel uses jazz as a template for establishing rhythm for her narrative and also for introducing contrapuntal notes between different events, characters, and between the past and the present. While the just ended First World War provides a certain sense of worldly weariness for the characters in the novel, the real backdrop to their attempts at self-fashioning is provided by the history of the American Great Migration, of which the 1920s furnished the tail end of the first big wave. The central characters Joe, Trace, and Violet had themselves migrated from the South to escape its anti-Black violence, but we later find that they are not entirely free of the memories and impulses that the South had inculcated in them. The overlaying of structures of feeling between the South and Harlem then provides a number of contrasting notes to their lives, manifest most clearly in the crisis with which the novel opens. Joe has killed his lover, the 18-year-old Dorcas, and Violet goes to the funeral parlor where she's lying for the funeral to slash her face with a knife. Violet finds a picture of Dorcas among her husband's things and places it on their mantelpiece at home. And both Joe and Violet sneak up in turns at night to take long glances at the picture for different reasons. This peculiar routine leads husband and wife gradually to mourn for their individual and mutual losses. From this strange set of events, the story unfolds, not as a straightforward narration, but as a series of sometimes jerky and sometimes smooth narrative movements, all amply modulated with references to the cityscape, the architecture, the people that populate it, and the various kinds of music that provide it with its soundtrack. We will see how Morrison weaves all these together into a story that echoes some of the themes in her previous novels, but also breaks new ground in representing the city as itself a character in jazz. While jazz is set in 1920s Harlem, it is the settling of Black people there and in New York City in general during the first Great Migration that provides the backdrop to the characters' attempts at self-fashioning, but also to their problematic relationships to their past. A reputed 6 million African Americans moved northward to cities such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Washington in what has been variously called the First Great Migration or the Great Northward Migration, which took place from the late 1800s until roughly 1940. They came to pursue jobs in the new manufacturing industries, but also to escape the violent anti-Black racism of the South. The Second World War brought the Second Great Migration that ran from 1940 until 1970, but this time oriented towards cities on the West Coast in response to recruitment opportunities in the defense industries that serviced the war. From the period when statistical records were kept from 1780 to 1910, about 90% of African Americans lived in the rural South. But by the end of the First Great Migration, almost 50% had moved up north to become urbanized. And by 1970, about 80% of African Americans lived in urban areas. The impact of migration and urbanization on African Americans was, however, more complicated than the statistics suggest. Harlem housed branches of many Black social welfare organizations, such as the NAACP and the Universal Negro Improvement Society, the second of which had been originally founded by the legendary Marcus Garvey. In Morrison's novel, we learn that regardless of the grief Violet caused, her name was brought up at the January meeting of the Salem Women's Club as someone needing assistance. But it was voted down because only prayer, not money, could help her now, because she had a more or less able husband who needed to stop feeling sorry for himself, and because a man and his family on 134th Street had lost everything in a fire. This is a microcosm of the work that Black welfare organizations carried out during the period. Despite the many welfare organizations, many newly arrived African Americans to New York and other East Coast cities were incorporated mainly into low-paying service jobs, where they had to unlearn the rural agricultural skills they had brought with them from the South, and to absorb new ideas of promptness, civil address, and even modes of dressing. In Morrison's novel, both Joe and Violet do not have formal jobs. He works as a cosmetics salesman, while she works as an itinerant hairdresser. But nobody else in their immediate circles holds down a formal job either. Building community is central to what the Black folk in the novel do, but this also entails much free time and the circulation of rumors. As we are told early in the novel, people of different ages often sit around looking for goings on as though it were a 5-cent triple feature on Saturday. Otherwise, they find themselves butting in the business of people whose names they can't even remember, and whose business is none of theirs. As we saw in our episode on Jean Reese's Wide Sargasso Sea, rumors and gossip are first of all disciplinary and set the boundaries for what is taken as acceptable behavior within the community. In a maxim I put forward in the final chapter of Oxford Street, Accra, I suggested that the rich have leisure while the poor have free time. But free time is not the same as freedom. Free time is the product of economy and entails attempts to exchange free time for wage time, that is to say, work. And so it is that free time is also connected to the burden of waiting for change and also to boredom. Even though Joe and Violet both work in the informal economy, it is also clear that they are heavily burdened by free time, and that this is coupled to the traumatic memories of their rural pasts. In the city, these aspects are translated into a form of restlessness for Joe, and for Violet, a feeling of emotional disorderliness. Morrison's Jazz opens as if we were being let into a world of gossip. Shh. I know that woman, we are told. She used to live with a flock of birds on Lenox Avenue. Know her husband too. He fell for an 18-year-old girl with one of those deep down spooky loves that made him so sad and happy he shot her just to keep the feeling going. From this rather cryptic opening, the story of Joe Trace and his wife Violet begins. The birds in the cages do not feature again in the story, because almost right after this opening, we are told that Violet ran back to their apartment through the snow to set them all out the windows to fly or freeze, including the parrot that said, "I love you." It turns out that this freeing of the birds has something to do with Violet's final acknowledgement that she could never be a mother, having had 3 miscarriages earlier in their marriage that rendered her incapable of bearing children. Her inability to bear children led to the channeling of her nurturing instincts in a variety of directions, including the desire to keep lots of birds in the hallway of their small apartment in Harlem. We get the suspicion that Violet is not entirely correct in the head and are given immediate cause for suspicion when we are told of how she rushed into the church in which Dorcas's dead body lay and slashed her cheek with a knife. Who in their right mind would want to do that? The information we get later in the novel about Dorcas being her husband's former 18-year-old mistress, whom he killed when she broke off their affair, does not serve to assuage our quandary as to Violet's violent motivations toward the dead body. As the narrative progresses, we get further hints about her state of mind. At one point, she makes off with a baby, and when caught, throws her head back and laughs a loud laugh as though she had forgotten the world. But in this laughter that forgets the world, Is it a sign of hysteria, or more profoundly, of her separation from the universe of acceptable forms? Violet's loud laugh confirms the theft of the baby for some and discredits it for others. While some suspect her immediately of madness, others think that she could not have been stealing the baby, especially as she had left her salon combs and other tools on the steps beside the pram where she took the child from 100 yards away. The loud laugh becomes the site of a mild interpretative conundrum for the other characters, as well as for us readers, and also offers another source of gossip about her. Later on, however, the voice of the narrator, which oscillates between third-person omniscience and a first-person unnamed narrator, outlines for us in greater detail the state of Violet's mind. One day, Violet is walking on the street when she decides to sit right down in the middle of the sidewalk. The crack in the sidewalk, shaped like a Y, was seen by her with particular vividness. They were real to her. She knew them. They were codes and touchstones of the world, capable of translation and possession. The narrator calls them her private cracks. As the narrator continues to explain to us, I call them cracks because that is what they were. Not openings or breaks, but dark fissures in the globe light of the day. She wakes up in the morning and sees with perfect clarity a string of small, well-lit scenes. In each one, something specific is being done. Food things, work things, customers and acquaintances are encountered, places entered. But she does not see herself doing these things. She sees them being done. The globe light holds and bathes each scene, and it can be assumed that at the curve where the light stops is a solid foundation. In truth, there is no foundation at all, but alleyways, crevices one steps across all the time. But the globe light is imperfect too. Closely examined, it shows seams, ill-glued cracks, and weak places beyond which is anything at all. Sometimes, when Violet isn't paying attention, she stumbles onto these cracks, like the time when, instead of putting her left heel forward, she stepped back and folded her legs in order to sit in the street. We should note how the repetition of the word globe immediately imports echoes from the settings of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, and thus encourages us to interpret Violet's condition with metaphors from drama. This is further emphasized in the fact that she herself adopts the position of a spectator with regard to the scenes of everyday life that unfold before her. In the vivid scenes laid out before her, hers is not the agency of a dramatic actor within the unfolding scenes, but that of a somewhat distant spectator, almost godlike and observant. Crucially also, the globe is both a globe and a dome of light, the two being interfused in the image of cracks emerging within the globe. These cracks and crevices may be interpreted as the openings into another world, one that requires Violet's eternal vigilance so as to prevent her from slipping into them. But sometimes she's obviously not quite successful at keeping from slipping in, as illustrated in her suddenly sitting down on the sidewalk. These cracks and crevices in the globe of light are the interstitial spaces within which her actions are interpreted as completely normal by her to sit down and take a rest because she's suddenly tired, and by the rest of the world as weird to sit down for no reason in the middle of the street. Another time, she actually lies down completely. In other words, what we have hinted at in the references to the cracks and crevices is a series of perspectival modulations between the perceived phenomenal world and that of another yet inchoate and unclaimed one. Elsewhere in Morrison's work, the perspectival modulations are presented as signs of spiritual insight, something we find with the character of CONSOLATA in the novel Paradise. But the difference between CONSOLATA and Violet is that CONSOLATA is in control of the perspectival modulations and can exercise a privileged mode of agency with respect to them, whereas Violet seems to be only a victim of the modulations and not in any way an empowered agent in control of her own consciousness. Her relationship to this liminal world of vivid forms is much like Sethi's relationship to the concept of rememory, which, as we saw in our second episode on Beloved, leads to the intensification of fragments of the past that leak into the present. In contrast to Violet, CONSOLATA, and Sethi, we should recall PECOLA's attitude to the cracks in the sidewalk as she walks to Mr. Jakubowski's candy store in the Bluest Eye. As they are for Violet, cracks in the sidewalk were very real to PECOLA. But in her case, she knew them. They were the codes and touchstones of the world, capable of translation and possession. She owned the crack that made her stumble, and owning it made her part of the world and the world a part of her. We see here a parallel fascination with the quotidian phenomenal world as a vector of the self. But unlike Violet, PECOLA's reaction to the cracks in the pavement is not yet that of eternal vigilance. Being an adolescent, taking solace from the cracks is a way of stabilizing a sense of identity amidst the flux and uncertainty that is the rest of her life. In jazz, the cityscape does not only provide a background to the events that unfold in the narrative, but also interacts with the internal workings of the characters' minds, as we have just seen with respect to Violet and the sidewalk. But this feature of city and consciousness is replicated in a less concentrated way for other characters as well. In the novel, the city offers promises of self-fashioning that are nevertheless crossed with dire retrievals of the past, sometimes as memories, but at other times in the form of instinctual drives and impulses. This is what we see with Joe Trace when he sets out to track down Dorcas and finally to shoot her. Back in Virginia, Joe had been a hunter, having discovered as a teenager that his mother had abandoned him as a child and taken herself into the nearby caves. Joe begins to track her down assiduously. He follows multiple subtle codes in the natural world over several months to find her. But when he finally does, he is not able to ask her the question that is uppermost in his mind. His mother is completely mad, and the moment is a very painful one for him. When Dorcas unceremoniously breaks off their affair, Joe is completely distraught and decides to track her down all over the city. The entire section of his hunt for Dorcas alternates with descriptions of how he tracked down his mother many years earlier in Virginia, thus suggesting that the impulses of hunting that he had cultivated in the South now convert the city itself into a semblance of what he thought he had left behind. Joe is trapped in an insistent structure of feeling that also converts the city he is now traversing into a spatial and emotional crisis of reordering and reinterpretation. As we might recall from our discussion in our previous episode on the Bourne ultimatum, one reason why the spy is always seen running in the spy thriller is because space itself is perceived to be full of potential danger. Thus, space becomes the subject of constant interpretation in the spy thriller, and especially when he or she is running from pursuers. Something similar happens with Joe in Jazz, but in his case, he is the one who becomes the predator hunter and not the prey. It is his attempt to stabilize a sense of identity in a spinning world of loss that makes him re-invoke the hunting impulses from the past. The absolute cold-bloodedness with which he shoots Dorcas when he finally spots her at a nightclub also suggests a deep atrophying of the spirit, since what he has actually done is to assimilate her to the status of a hunted animal, and when found, unceremoniously killed. Despite his feelings of deep loss after that, the repeated journeys he makes to the mantelpiece to look on her picture suggest that he is in the grips of a momentous melancholy, and that he is really not capable of mourning and letting go of her in his mind. As we might recall from our previous episodes on TAYEB SALIH's Season of Migration to the North, and also on Ryan Coogler's The Black Panther, melancholia is the product of the categorical refusal to substitute the lost object for another. It is a form of entrapment that morphs into all manner of compensatory mechanisms. Everywhere in the New York City sections of jazz, there are references to jazz music either as a background to unfolding events or something that characters listen and respond to. The responses are, however, not all positive. For Alice Manfred, Dorcas's mixed-race aunt, jazz and music like it are signs of a decadence, wantonness, and indiscipline which she tries to stamp out of her niece. Alice is obviously unsuccessful because it is precisely the sense of abandon that the city and its musical forms proffer to her that Dorcas seizes upon to shape the core of her rebellious identity. We should pause to note that in almost all of Morrison's novels, what she calls high yellow characters frequently stand in for the most abhorrent anti-black sentiments. We find these sometimes expressed through high yellow characters such as Darlene and Maureen Peale in The Bluest Eye, Helene Wright in Sula, and Ruth the Dead in Song of Solomon. In Paradise, the entire discourse on colorism is central to the conflict in the breakaway black town of Ruby. But there, the implicit privilege normally attributed to high yellow characters in her other novels is inverted in favor of the descendants of the 8 rock black families that come together to found the town. However, in Paradise, Morrison also shows that the discourse on blackness as the foundation for identity in the new town also reproduces different forms of exclusion, including those of patriarchy, misogyny, and avid material acquisitiveness. Each of these Morrison novels provides us with different installments on the discourse of colorism. But in jazz, colorism is tied mainly to attitudes to black music and thus to aspects of black cultural history. We may want to recall the ending of James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues from last week, where the unnamed narrator suddenly experiences an epiphany on listening to his brother play blues on the piano with his band at the jazz club in Greenwich Village. It is really important to look at Morrison's exploration of colorism in relation to the fine arguments she makes about the American literary tradition's overall response to blackness in America, as demonstrated in Playing in the Dark, her collection of essays that I urge everyone to read. For apart from being a Nobel Prize winner and one of the greatest of American writers, Toni Morrison was also an extraordinarily nuanced and sensitive literary critic. The world misses her greatly. Thank you very much. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode description. And if you like this episode, please give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes. And enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.